Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Collaborative Science for Estuaries webinar series. This is Nick Sobral with the Science Collaborative, joined remotely by Lynn Vaccaro. Thank you for joining us for this month's webinar, which is titled Understanding the Role Coastal Marshes Play in Protecting Communities from Storm Surge and Flooding. Quick bit about the reserve system and the Science Collaborative. The National Estuarine Research Reserve System, or NERRS or NERRS, is a national network of unique research reserves as shown on this map. This is a NOAA program that works in collaboration with a local place-based partner, either a state agency, university, or nonprofit. Each reserve site includes programs focused on land stewardship, research and scientific monitoring, training programs for the public and local officials, and education. The Science Collaborative supports science for estuarine and coastal decision makers by coordinating regular funding opportunities and supporting user-driven collaborative research, assessment, and science transfer activities that address critical coastal management needs identified by the reserves. For the purposes of today's webinar, all attendees were muted upon entry and will be handling questions via the question feature on the console, which you can see in the photo on the right side. We'll have time to answer questions at the end of today's webinar, but we encourage you to submit them as they occur to you throughout the webinar by entering them into the questions field on the console. Before I introduce our presenters today, just a quick look at the registration for today's webinar, and we were just absolutely blown away by the sheer number of people who registered for today's webinar. So welcome to all the new folks, and to all our returning people, welcome back, and we hope you enjoy today's webinar. So with that, I will go ahead and introduce our two speakers for the day. I'm pleased to welcome Peter Sheng and Sarah Fernald. Peter Sheng is an emeritus professor and adjunct research professor of coastal and oceanographic engineering at the University of Florida, specializing in coastal hydrodynamic and biogeochemical processes and multidisciplinary modeling. His recent interests include the impact of climate change on coastal inundation and understanding the roles of coastal wetlands for buffering coastal communities from flood and wave damage. As the project lead for this project, Peter coordinated a team of multidisciplinary scientists and led the development and application of the surge wave and economic loss models. Sarah is a marine scientist and the research coordinator at the Hudson River Reserve, and she is responsible for managing long-term monitoring and research at this reserve. For this project, Sarah worked with Peter to ensure that modeling scenarios aligned with proposed marsh management plans and the interests of Piermont Village stakeholders. And with that, I will go ahead and pass it over to Sarah.
Thank you, Nick. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to attend today. I'm Sarah Fernald, the research coordinator for the Hudson River National Estuarine Research Reserve. The right slide. And I'm happy to present one of our Near Science Collaborative projects to you today, understanding the role of coastal marshes in protecting communities from storm surge and flooding. The Hudson River NERRS, or HRNR, is a federal program with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and we are in partnership with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. Our reserve was designated in 1982, and we are comprised of 5,000 protected areas of tidal wetland across 4 component sites. And here's a map of our component sites from north to south. Our northernmost site is Stockport Flats, just south of the New York capital of Albany. Downriver from that is Tivoli Bays, then Iona Island, and furthest south is the component site that's the topic of today's talk, Piermont Marsh. The HRNR headquarters is at the Norrie Point Environmental Center, which is located at the midway point of the Hudson between our 4 component sites. Like Nick said, we are one of the 29 research reserves across the country with a shared mission to promote stewardship of the nation's estuaries through science and education using a system of protected areas. And the Near Science Collaborative grants, just wanted to explain briefly, is a bit different than your typical academic research grant. It begins with the NERRS identifying important coastal issues, both to the research reserves and to local partners. We then put those coastal issues out in an RFP that researchers respond to. And at that point, the research reserve connects those researchers with the end users of the information who would be directly addressing the coastal issue. And often we involve a neutral facilitator to help that conversation along. And the point of this is to get those end users involved at the very beginning planning stages of the research so they can help direct and guide it. And the purpose of that is to get to an end product that we know that the end users can directly use. So often there are academic publications produced, but there's usually a specific tool, a map, a model in this case, a calculator that the end users can use in directly addressing the coastal issue. So the coastal issue we were looking at for this project is overall protecting tidal wetland function. This is a beautiful picture of Piermont Marsh, and we know that healthy tidal marshes support a wide variety of native plants, animals, insects, and microorganisms. Native vegetation supports marsh health and maximizes the benefits that these tidal wetlands provide for fish, wildlife, and humans. And potential threats to native vegetation, such as invasive species, need to be closely monitored. A diverse assemblage of species helps to protect the marsh, as each species fills a different niche and provides a range of environmental services. And on this list of environmental services, the one we'll be focusing on today is the last one, storm protection, which is the topic of Peter Sheng's study. In 2012, our area was hit by Superstorm Sandy, and particularly the village of Piermont was impacted by this storm. Knowing this and knowing the ecological importance of the marsh, the reserve drafted a marsh management plan in 2017. And this focused on protecting the native vegetation by controlling 40 acres of Phragmites in 3 phases over 10 years. And those 3 phases are depicted in that map at the middle of the screen. However, the Piermont Village residents voiced opposition to the control of Phragmites. So we're currently in the process of updating our management plan this year. We will remove the plan for large areas of Phragmites control, being responsive to those public comments. And we're also planning to include some progress and results from past year's monitoring, and especially using Dr. Sheng's final results to update our draft management plan. So if anyone has any questions, particularly about the reserve's role or our management plan, here is my contact information, and I'd be happy to address those. But next, I would like to introduce Dr. Peter Sheng of the University of Florida. And over the last half a decade, I've enjoyed working with Peter on this project. We developed modeling scenarios, making sure that we're able with our management plan and the interest of the village residents. As the lead, Peter was the front runner of coordinating the research team and developing the surge wave model and economic loss model, which we'll all enjoy hearing more about now. So on to you, Peter.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for a nice introduction. That makes my presentation much easier. It covered a lot of introduction that I was going to talk about. And so what I'm going to talk about today, again, is to understand the value of coastal marshes for protecting coastal communities from storm surge and flooding in a changing climate, not just in today's climate, but we're looking into 21st century all the way to 2100, considering many factors. As Sarah said, NERRS Science Collaborative is NOAA funded, managed by University of Michigan. And we have a multidisciplinary team from various universities. And also NERRS is a very important part of this collaborative study. And I'm going to talk about the members of the team in a few minutes. And echoing what Sarah said, and Piermont is really a beautiful place. Piermont Village is very historical. It's a nice, quaint village. In addition to that, there are lots of nice animals, wading birds for you to enjoy in a different time of the year. So it all started, this project, because of Superstorm Sandy. in 2012. And one of the main reasons is this humongous size of Hurricane Superstorm Sandy. It's about 1,200 miles, 1,100 miles, and the landfall location is along in New Jersey, Atlantic City. So even though it's only a Category 1 hurricane, but it coincided with the high tide, and that created a major flooding, catastrophic damage to New Jersey and New York, as well as some damage to this village of Piermont. Piermont is about 15 miles north of New York City. And the village is protected by this marsh along the south, the 200 acres of Phragmites-dominated marsh. And here we have 40 acre of potential restoration area proposed by NERRS. So this is a focus of this study. In this project today, we're going to mainly talk about the local scale, a study where we've did a very high resolution model with about 4-meter resolution. So we can model the storm surge and wave and damage to the properties. But in order to do this local size scale study, we have to consider regional scale, which is shown in this red rectangle here that includes New Jersey, New York, and Connecticut. We had to do a model for this large region, tri-state region, simulate Sandy, and simulate a whole ensemble of all possible storms to answer the question of this project. And the project was really formed, the conceptual part of the project was formed during a very cold January night in 2015, where I was the invited guest to talk about what, as a scientist, could do to help the community and the marsh managers to understand the value of Piermont Marsh in protecting people in the village from flooding damage. And even though it was a very, very cold, freezing night, inside this workshop was very, very warm. People from the village, from the marsh management, had very interesting, sometimes a bit intense discussion about the future of the marsh. At the end of the day, people decided there was enough idea to formulate a proposal. So over the next few months, we developed a couple of proposals. In 2016, we got a project from NERRS Science Collaborative to look into this issue. And the main questions we're trying to answer in this project are 3. First, what is the economic value of the buffering service the Piermont Marsh provide now and in the future? And how would the marsh's buffering service change if marsh manager gradually restore vegetation in 40 acres of the marsh with native marsh? The last one, how will marsh buffering capacity change as sea level rise in the future? So this is the focus of the study, and I will try to provide the answer. And hopefully by the end, you'll be convinced that we have answered all these questions. I want to thank everyone on the project team. I'm the PI, as Sarah said, but we have a very diversified, hardworking team. We have people from University of Florida and University of Miami, from NASA Goddard Institute of Space Sciences. We also have 3 PhD students involved in the project in modeling and data collection. We have many stakeholders. We have USGS hydrologists involved, people from Palisades Interstate Park Commission, Klaus Jacob from PWRC, Columbia University, Nathan Mitchell from the village, and we do have a independent consensus builder. Bennett Brooks play a very important role in promoting the communications between the village folks and managers and the scientists on the team. I have to thank the collaborative lead, Heather Cherloff, and formerly Betsy Blair, who retired. And of course, last but not the least, Sarah Fernald, who has been research coordinator. It's been a very fun to work with on this project. But let's not forget about the project manager, Lynn Vaccaro from University of Michigan, who's been very supportive of this project throughout. So how do we do this study? How do we answer the questions? And I would just say that we need to integrate dynamic model simulations with extensive data. That includes wind data, hurricane data, surge data, wave data, vegetation data, and also damage data during Sandy and other situations. And we do this with a little bit of artificial intelligence. I'll mention what that means. It's a buzzword these days, so we do have a little bit of that, but I'm not going to dwell too much on it. So basically, this is the framework of how we do our study. The green stuff is data. Yellow represents model. Red represents products. So we basically look at the regional scale model or surge wave model for New Jersey, New York, Connecticut. And from there, we provide boundary condition to this high resolution model. With, again, it's 4-meter resolution. And after that, we have the wave and surge during Sandy, and also the 1% event. From there, we do economic analysis, look at the damage to the residential structures, estimate the damage, and estimating the value of the marshes, and provide everything in the tool, in the geo tool to the end users so they can use it for community resiliency planning. So on the regional study, I'm not going to go into it, but I'm just going to mention this paper, which just came out recently in Nature Scientific Reports. And this is the link where you can click it. And this is open journal articles you can download for free. And here's the title of it. And this paper mainly looking at the regional scale. We look at the value of the marshes. These are mostly Spartina marshes in New Jersey, New York, and Connecticut, looking at their role during Sandy and during 1% flood and wave event. So what I want to mention is the 1% event is pretty much like the FEMA flood map. You know, you get it's a 1% annual chance event. And that's what we use to assess the value of wetland for protecting property damage. So what happened in the paper is that we found out a few things. One is that the value of the wetland in buffering storm damage is highly dependent on a few things in this box here. It depends on the storms, which is represented by the average wave crest, which includes the flood and wave. It depends on the wetland coverage. It depends on the at-risk property value. So it's not just a function of one thing. So if you look at during Sandy, the marshes reduced about 8% of loss. But if you look at the 1% storm, flood and wave event, the marshes reduced 50% of loss. So it's a storm event independent, and therefore you cannot attach a single value to the value of marsh in any place. And this function we developed is on zip code level. Of course, we could go down further, but if you have more detailed vegetation data, one thing to know is the marshes in New Jersey, New York, they're pretty low. They're like 30 centimeters and 80 centimeters. They're not like 3 meters Phragmites marsh in Piermont, okay? So that's one major difference that we're talking about. So what happened to the village during Sandy? And we have maximum flood height we computed the maximum flood height, about 9.58 feet, 9.38 feet here. The people like to work with the British system. We write a paper, we have to convert everything to metric, and these are the maximum wave height. So we compare with this height, and model results are pretty accurate. And we also have to look at these 559 property that in this Piermont Village, and that's the main focus of this. We want to know how the marsh can protect the people in these properties. So one major question people like to know is, what if the tall and rigid Phragmites marsh were replaced by the shorter and more flexible typha, which is from Iona Island nearby, as Sarah mentioned. One on the left is Phragmites, one on the right is typha. The major difference between them is Phragmites is very tall, it's very dense, very rigid, and it doesn't have much variation over the season. You go to spring and fall, their height and density is pretty much the same, but typha becomes much shorter in the spring, early summer, although they grow into higher elevation during the fall. So there is seasonal variation there, okay? And so these are the differences. So what we found is that during Sandy, either the Phragmites marsh or typha marsh, they could not buffer much the flood, because you look at the width of the marsh, it's less than 1 kilometer east-west, and the peak wind came from east, so therefore it only buffered about 1% of the flood. You need about tens of kilometers to buffer the surge. But on the other hand, the wave was dissipated very quickly. At the village, the wave was dissipated by about 2/3 from the wave at the edge of the marsh. And as well, the currents were slowed down and debris were kept at the southeast corner of the marsh. And so therefore, if the typha replaced Phragmites, and if a storm had come in September, then it would have been okay. But if the storm came in May, when typha was much lower, then the buffering capacity would have not been there. Of course, you take out the marsh, you won't have the buffering capacity. So this is a nice diagram, and Ling and her shop did for us, and basically you can tell, let's see. Yeah, so during Sandy, with the Phragmites marsh, the flood is unchanged at the village. Is unchanged at the village. The wave was reduced by about 2/3. Sorry, and why does it? Now the middle one shows if we're typha, it would have kept. Sorry, you would still have a little bit of flood, and you had wave at the village. Wave will be about 1/3 of what you have at the edge of the marsh. When you have no marsh, the wave will come in all the way, causing a lot of damage, and debris would have come in also because the currents would be much stronger. So now we want to talk about the structural loss. You know, how much was lost, damage during Sandy? How did it compare with the FEMA NFIP, National Flood Insurance Program, loss payout, and how much additional damage would incur if Piermont Marsh were absent? And what would the proposed restoration and sea level rise impact the buffering capacity? How would that impact the potential damage to the property? So in order to do the damage, we actually use some of the concept from FEMA. This is the diagram, and talks about the different flood zones according to wave height, you have different zones defined. So in these different zones, you calculate the damage accordingly. And we use basically the 1% flood elevation, 1% wave height, and we calculate base flood elevation and wave crest. And we find out which flood zone each house is in. Depends on which zone you're in. We use the different formulas. We use the damage function developed by the Army Corps of Engineers North Atlantic Coastal Study, NERRS. Okay. We didn't try to invent new method or damage function for this study because that damage assessment is a very empirical. It's not really as robust as the storm surge and wave modeling, where we know the processes, we can write definitive equations. But the damage assessment is involves a lot of empirical assumptions because we don't have enough understanding, enough data. So there's definitely going to be some uncertainties in the damage assessment. The good thing is we always have the FEMA damage values where we can compare with. So let's talk about what happens during Sandy. Sandy, there were about 41 buildings in Piermont Village got paid by FEMA. And we calculate the loss in terms flood-induced loss and wave-induced loss and the total loss with the wetland present. And then we do the calculation by removing the wetland. This is the middle column is all simulated value. There's nothing to compare with. But from there, we can look at the avoided loss in dollar values. And so we say the wetlands avoided about 563K or 15.1% of the loss. But at NFIP payouts, it's about 3.47 million compared to 3.72, so it's not really bad, right? But we have to look at all the houses, all the buildings. In that case, the total loss comes about 11.9 million. With the wetland removed, we would have 902,000 or 7.6% additional damage due to removal of the wetland. So this is a way of looking at the value of wetland. This is sort of a relative value of the wetland. And so this 11.9 million compares quite well with the reported loss by PWRC, which is about 20 million, which includes many other losses that this model does not include. Details of this Sandy and the 1% situation calculation can be found in a recent paper published in Environmental Research Letters. This is online. Again, this is open, so anybody can download for free from the website. And we talked about all the things we have gone through so far. So the Marsh value is for Sandy is about 924,550 per square kilometers. So, or you can convert to value per square meter. That's about 92 cents per square meter for protecting village from Sandy. All right, but we need to look at the 1% event. We cannot do all the resiliency planning or marsh management based on a single storm, because we found that all that depends heavily on the storms. It can change a lot with the storm. So in order to look at that, we rely on these storm prediction, the storm ensemble predicted by Timothy Hall at NASA Goddard Institute of Space Sciences, who use a statistical hurricane model for the North Atlantic to provide us with tens of thousands of possible tracks. And from there, we deduced a smaller ensemble of about 300 storms to simulate the potential loss from a combination of storms. Well, basically, Sandy is a 700-year storm, according to Timothy Hall. Therefore, it generates very high surge, tide, and wave. But the storm ensemble includes many different storms, which are less intense but more frequent compared to Sandy. They come in different sizes and come from different directions, different forward speed. And each storm generates different response, different flood and wave, different damage at the village. In some cases, the wind is from southeast. The flood is going to be buffered by the long axis of the marsh, which is a few kilometers. In other storms, like Sandy, the flood is not buffered at all, but the wave is buffered. So we have to look at these 1% event, which is a combination of the storm ensemble. Sorry about this. This is trying to finish too. So the current coastal resiliency planning must be based on the role of marsh in buffering surge and wave and damage in the 1% event. This looks at the cumulative effect of various storms, okay? And flood and wave will increase due to storms and sea level rise. And these are the 1% flood elevation on the left, 1% wave elevation on the right. Flood elevation, mostly yellow, is between 6 to 8 feet. In the village is between 0 and 2 feet, right? 1% wave height is about half foot in the village. All right, you can see the yellow on the boundary. The wave is very high on the boundary of the marsh, but gets dissipated quickly over a few hundred feet. And then we look at this. The other one is at 2050 with 18-inch sea level rise. The flood elevation, 1% flood elevation, is quite a bit higher. It goes up to in the village is a little bit higher, not too much higher. It goes up to 1 foot, and wave height does increase a little bit as well. So we can produce these maps by considering the storm ensemble as well as the sea level rise. We can do that for 2100 as well. For sea level rise, we use the results from NPCC, New York. This is one that Klaus Jacobs served on as a panelist. NPCC told us sea level rise is going to be pretty high. It's going to be around, if you look at this, the cross, the start, I mean, these cross represents the 90th percentile value, all right? It's pretty high for 2100. It goes to about it's about 75 feet. You notice that between 2050 and 2100 is considerable uncertainty in sea level rise. And so we picked the mid value for 2050, which is about 18-inch. We picked 18-inch for 2050 for consideration, but Klaus recommended we use in the extreme, the 100th percentile, 114-inch extreme sea level rise. It's the worst case for consideration. And here is some results that based on the paper by Nara Tabak and others published a couple years ago, looking at the fate of the marsh under sea level rise. The results were produced with the SLAM model. On the lower right is the marsh disappeared, marsh inundated because of the high sea level rise with low accretion rate. So basically, according to this, the marsh will not be there by 2100. So this is one condition we used for simulation. This is one of the scenarios that we used. But we know that in that paper, they also showed the accretion rate. The one on top is the high accretion rate, which goes up to about 12, 14 millimeter per year on the high end, depending on the tidal conditions. They use the low value, the yellow line, which is 3, 4 millimeter per year. So with the low accretion rate, yes, the marsh will disappear. But with the high accretion rate, actually, if we use 12 millimeter per year, the bottom can be filled up by about 1 meter from the nowadays topography. So, so there is a chance the marsh could keep up with the sea level rise. There is a chance it can keep up with the sea level rise because availability of sands, high accretion rate, increased turbulence, and large leaf area index of Phragmites compared to other native species like Typhus, Batina. And this is something that I think Judy Weiss in New Jersey, they found in New Jersey that Phragmites is best in keeping up with the sea level rise because the high accretion rate. And also Phragmites produces more litter on the surface, and this litter decays more slowly and therefore traps more sediments for a longer time. And this is from a quote from Judy Weiss. So, so anyway, this has to do with the 2100 because there's a lot of uncertainty about 2100. For one thing, the storms between 2150 and 2100 is highly uncertain. You look at different climate models, the predictions about future storms change drastically. So question is whether the storms will become a lot more intense or just a little bit intense. There's no consensus. So we decided to keep the same storm ensemble for our simulations, although the sea level rise scenarios changes. So here we have a summary table of all the calculations we've done in terms of the property damage. The first two are the Superstorm Sandy. The first one is with the current Phragmites condition. The projected damage to the village is 11.9 million. If we take the vegetation out in the second scenario, it goes to 12.8 million. Damage increases. And scenario 0 is 2020, the current condition. Now we're talking about the 1% event, 1% fly in the wave event. The damage is 18.8 million to the property. And if we remove the vegetation, damage goes up to 21 million. And scenario 1 is we start doing the management, the three phases. Basically divides the 40-acre area into three regions. First phase will remove the vegetation from that one area 1, all right, and that has induced no change. And scenario 2, we remove the vegetation from area 2, and the vegetation in area 1 is grown up. And then phase 3 will remove the vegetation in area 3 and replace with Typha. So eventually it will be complete. At 2050, we'll have the management complete with 18-inch sea level rise. But in 2025, we have 6-inch sea level rise. So what you're seeing here is a combination of management in 3 phases, sea level rise increasing, storm largely remain as the same as the current climate, but we see the damage to the property gradually increasing. And the last scenario is when all the marshes are gone, according to the low accretion rate, the damage will go up to 63.3 million. So these future results are going to appear in this paper that in preparation nearly finished, and this is going to have a lot of authors on this. And so what is the value of Piermont Marsh? So in Sandy, we found out it saved 902,000 or 7.56%, it gets to about 90 cents per square meter. For the 100-year flood and wave event, it saved 2.13 million possible damage, or 11.34%. And we calculated a value of about $2.64 per square meter. And so the value of the marsh actually goes up. If by 2050, with 18-inch sea level rise, the value of the marsh goes up to $4.46 per square meter. These are 2018 values, okay? So you might ask, why did the value go up? It's because the potential damage had the marsh being removed increased substantially, all right, become $31 million. So therefore the value of the marsh actually goes up. Now, according to the worst case scenario, 2100, the value of the marsh becomes zero. But as I mentioned, if we use the high accretion rate case, assuming marsh gets enough nutrients to grow and keep up with sea level rise, and I haven't typed this on here, but I got the value that the marsh still has a value of about a little over $3 per square meter by 2100 if the marsh gets high accretion rate. So this is interesting to know. And in comparison to the marshes in New Jersey, I haven't reported in that Nature paper, but I did a calculation with the results in the Nature paper. The value of the marshes in New Jersey on the zip code level, they come down to about 60 cents per square meter. So relatively speaking, these Piermont Marsh is much more valuable than the Spartina Marsh in New Jersey, as it should be, because these marshes are much lower, sparser compared to the tall and rigid, dense Piermont Marsh. So if you want to buy stock, you know which one to buy, right? And then last but not least, we actually developed a tool. Sarah mentioned we developed a geo tool. It has all those maps, and plus we have these damage maps. We have these damage maps by 2020 for a 100-year event. What is the average annualized loss in Piermont Village? We actually plot them in hexagon, which includes a number of properties. For the sake of privacy, we don't want people to know these sensitive information. People who don't need to know, don't need to know. And so 2020, 2050, we see the damage will increase gradually. And so this tool is made available to the village of Piermont as well as Hudson River NERRS for resiliency planning and help them with the marsh management plan. So to summarize everything, we found that Piermont Marsh buffered wave current and debris during Sandy, but not surge and flood. So I missed the word. Surge and flood were not really buffered because they were too narrow. Replacing Phragmites with typhi in the 40-acre area would not diminish the buffering capacity of the marsh. In Sandy, structural loss during the 1% event will increase due to storms, sea level rise, and marsh loss. But marsh's value actually will continue to increase until overwhelmed by extreme sea level rise in 2100, assuming low accretion rate, but it will retain its value if the accretion rate is high, as many studies have found out. Evaluation of coastal marsh for flood protection requires integration of dynamic model results and extensive data over regional and local scales. If you try to skip the dynamic model simulation, skip the dynamic model results, and you pretend the process of generation of surge and wave by wind can be neglected, And then you get very erroneous values, as I have seen in some of the papers in literature, including some that just appear in proceedings from National Academy of Sciences. So this is a very important point. We'd like to have the marsh to be valuable, but we need to be very science-based when we do that analysis. We also feel that to enhance the marsh's buffering capacity, it's important to ensure sediment supply and prevent marsh edge erosion. And this is something that I know Hudson River NERRS is actively engaged in, as well as Hudson River Foundation, as many other researchers. This geo tool is developed. Yeah, so this is what I mentioned, the New Jersey marsh value, about 65 cents per square meter. Definitely Piermont is safer than New Jersey in that regard. Okay, so I think I'm going to stop here, and thank you for your attention. I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Peter. At this point, we're going to start our Q&A session. Oh, good, there's Sarah. I was going to say I'd like to welcome Sarah back as well. Okay, so we have a couple of questions rolling in already. I'd like to take the first one over to Sarah because this is a question that's been asked by quite a few people already. So there have been a number of questions about why the village was concerned about controlling Phragmites at the outset of the project. Could you explain their concerns a little bit more and also share how village residents and leaders are reacting to and using this new information?
Sure. Well, the village keenly felt the impacts of Superstorm Sandy, and they could tell the residences that were near the marsh. You could visually see how the debris was trapped in the marsh versus the other residences who were hit by floating logs, literally boats dropped in the road. So they were very keenly aware that the Phragmites protected them. So when they heard that we were concerned about Phragmites as lacking biodiversity and we were looking to get rid of it, they were traumatized and they were very concerned, and it was their homes, very rightly so. So they're a wonderful group to engage with. It was a very passionate community. They were very highly educated and super engaged in the whole process, and very eager to dig into the fine details of this very complicated science. So I think they were really appreciative of the work that's been done, and we look forward to continuing to reach out to them as we revise our plans with managing Phragmites. We are pulling back, looking at doing some much more limited work with geotextile in protecting the areas of more native biodiverse plants in the middle of the marsh. And then, like Peter said, really using his results to look at edge erosion and to start some pilot projects with different types of edge erosion control devices, and perhaps pull in some blue carbon and look at how protecting the edge helps the marsh to sequester carbon as a possible source of funding for edge stabilization, and an extra value of the marsh. I think that answered the question.
I believe so. Okay. Okay, so we'll go to another question here. This is a question for Peter, and this was when you were talking about the 1% event. So we have a question from the audience that just wants to know if a 1% event is the same thing as a 100-year flood or storm. I guess maybe you could explain if there's a nuance there to, if there's a difference, or what the nuance would be.
Okay, so 100-year storm and 100-year flood are very different. Okay, like I said, Sandy is a 700-year storm. All right, but the flood event we're talking about is the 1% of 100-year flood event. This is basically goes back to the concept of flood map, the FEMA flood map. And what you're buying insurance for is the 100-year flood elevation. So that is the elevation. So if you have a 100-year flood elevation, that means you have a 100% chance of getting that elevation in the next 100 years. You have 1% chance of getting that elevation in the next 100 years. or you have 26% chance of getting that elevation in 30-year mortgage period. So that is the concept. It's a 100-year flood event is different from the 100-year storm event. 100-year storm doesn't produce a 100-year flood. Okay. Does that answer the question?
I believe so.
Okay.
Okay, so we have another question here. This one is about the cattails that were used. So are the cattails that were used in for this project, for the research, were they native or invasive cattails? And is there any evidence that Typha would be better than Phragmites in terms of buffering ability?
Well, as I mentioned, in the simulation we used the native Typha property from nearby Iona Island, and Typha by nature is shorter, sparser, and less rigid. It's more flexible, and so as a result, it is not as capable of buffering wave and flood. But in the case of the Typha in Iona Island, they were pretty tall. And so if we had Sandy, blow over Typha in Piermont Marsh, they were able to buffer quite a bit of the wave, just like Phragmites were. But Typha is not as desirable because it is more seasonal. It becomes very low and very sparse during non-growing season. But Phragmites remain tall and dense and throughout the year. So that's where the difference is.
Okay, another question. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, just to add that it is the native Typha angustifolia cattail strain.
Thank you. Question here for Sarah. Why does the management plan include replacing Phragmites with Typha instead of Spartina?
The plan was to remove the Phragmites and let the native seed bank return. There wasn't a plan to actively plant one thing over the other, and it was the assumption that Phragmites removal would lead to cattail return. The Iona Island component site that Peter just referenced has done a lot of work on Phragmites removal, and that is the species that came back dominantly was the cattail Typha angustifolia.
Excellent, thank you. See, next question here. We had one webinar participant who noted that Phragmites can actually promote accretion and foster elevation gain for wetlands, which can help marshes keep up with sea level rise. Do you have any further comments in response to that comment?
Is that a question for who?
Either one of you. Why don't you go ahead, Peter?
Well, I mentioned the name of Judy Weiss, and she's a real expert on this topic, and she just wrote a report for New Jersey DEP, and she looked at all the past elevation data, many marsh transects in New Jersey, and her study clearly pointed to the superior ability of Phragmites to keep up with sea level rise. I think she might be in the audience. She might be a best person to answer that question.
And just to add on to that, the reserve is actively monitoring marsh accretion rates using surface elevation tables, which establish a solid benchmark in the marsh and then have a series of pins that you lower and get millimeter accuracy measures of the marsh elevation, and do this in a series over time across seasons. So we have a transect of those across the marsh. One of our concerns is, though, as Peter said, it's a high elevation marsh, so it is irregularly flooded. On the plus side, the Hudson River is very sediment rich. So one thing we're not sure if we're seeing, if there is a very large sediment supply, that the sediment might get trapped in the Phragmites toward the edge of the marsh and might not get transported to the interior of the marsh. But we are doing ongoing monitoring, planning for long-term into the future to continue that to assess the accretion rates across the whole span of the marsh.
Okay, got a question for Sarah. Could you elaborate a bit more on what edge stabilization means?
Sure. So that's a pilot project that we're working on. It's very small scale at the moment. It's about 500 feet of the shoreline at the edge of the marsh to the river's edge. And we really want to assess some different stabilization techniques like core rolls or bag shells, oyster castles, to see what's going to be most effective for the dynamics of the edge of Piermont Marsh, and to quantify, how it's going to fill in behind it, and if there's carbon stored behind the edge stabilization, if we can use that to support, this is adding value to the marsh. So we have a current pilot project teed up for that with some monitoring and research around it, and we're hoping to, once we identify the best technique for our area, to be able to expand that throughout the marsh eventually. That will also go into the forthcoming management plan that we're developing, in collaboration with the village and our other partners, Palisade Parks Commission, who also manage the land with New York State DEC.
Okay. Before we go any further, I will just quickly say, since we have a few questions still lined up here, that our presenters have graciously agreed to stay an extra few minutes after the end of our scheduled session to answer a few more questions. So we're going to try to get through as many of these as we can here. So moving on to the next question, how intensive is the modeling that you did for this project? Would it be feasible to run it for a larger area, for example, the entire US coast, at regular intervals, or would that be prohibitively expensive?
For the entire US coast, it is, well, we were running with a 4-meter resolution for Piermont Marsh. And for that New Jersey, New York, Connecticut study, we're running with a resolution of about 30-meter resolution. So no one at this point can afford to run 4-meter resolution for the entire US coast. But we can run the 30-meter resolution for the entire US coast. Yes, just that's something we can do. But for small area focused, like Piermont Village, Piermont Marsh, we can do 4-meter resolution, no problem. And that's what we're doing in Florida as well. Okay, so, but going 4-meter for the entire nation, it's, we gotta wait for the quantum computer. Okay.
Another question for Peter. In addition to marsh vegetation height and stiffness, what other marsh attributes were important in the models to determine the marsh's buffering ability?
Okay, so actually we use a 3-dimensional model, coupled surge and wave model, and we turn all those vegetation parameters, the height, the stem density, leaf area, if any, and debris near the bottom, stem density, stem diameter. We turn all that into 2 parameters. One is the frontal area, is the area that the flow sees, and the other one is the wetted area, is all the areas that come into contact with the flow. So these 2 areas needs to be calculated from the raw data of vegetation, which are vertically varying. We need to calculate that over each 4-meter square area. And so we produce that database, we plug into the model uses those information to calculate the effect on flow and wave. Okay.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, got another question for Sarah. If you eventually find that the marshes aren't keeping up, will you consider using thin layer deposition to increase their elevation? This is showing promise in New Jersey.
We have collaborated with some folks in New Jersey on their thin layer placement projects. We had a small capacity building project to look at that in our area. The struggle in the Hudson River Estuary is having a sediment source nearby to the marsh. The Hudson River Estuary is also a Superfund site, and our sediment is contaminated. So issues with depositing, dredged contaminated sediment upon the marsh surface would be a permitting issue for that too. There's a lot of complications in that, but no, it's not off the table, and is something that we are considering for the future if it does look like it's the sediment supply is lacking.
Thank you. Okay, another question here about the model. Was it a SLAM model? And that is, for those who are not familiar, sea level affecting marshes model that was used to simulate vegetation changes with sea level rise. If not, what did they use?
Right. The only thing we used there was really for the scenario of 2100. Basically, that paper I mentioned, TABAC, they simulated under different conditions of sea level rise and accretion rate. We used the high sea level rise and low accretion rate, which basically says marsh will be lost, inundated, completely inundated. We used that scenario. Basically, we just took all the marsh out. And that was the only thing we really used from the SLAM. We didn't use the other scenarios. Well, I made up that scenario with 1 meter accretion by 2100. So we changed the topography and we allowed the marsh to continue to remain at the current height, and calculated that the marsh will still have like $3 per square meter. We didn't really use the SLAM model results. Okay.
Okay, next question. There have been a few questions about the range of ecological services provided by different plants. Do the different plants under consideration have other ecosystem services, such as carbon sequestration, that might also add to the marsh value?
My understanding, with my limited understanding, I've been reading literatures. My understanding is Phragmites has superior quality in terms of carbon sequestration compared to some other species. But that's not to say the other native species don't have the carbon sequestration ability. Sarah?
Anything to add, Sarah?
Sure. Carbon sequestration is something we're actively looking into. There's actually not much data on brackish to freshwater tidal wetlands like we have in the Hudson, but we do know that the habitat quality of Phragmites is slightly lower than some of the other species, such as cattail, especially for breeding birds, other foraging wildlife, fish species that are able to access the interior of the marsh. Not to say that there's not some habitat use of Phragmites, but it's just considered to be a slightly lower quality.
That's interesting. Okay, I'm gonna just keep cruising through questions here so you can get through, or try to get through almost all of them if we can. Still quite a few lined up. Have you modeled the buffering capability of mangroves versus no wetlands in warmer climates, for example, Florida?
I have a current project funded by NOAA looking at that issue in Collier County, Southwest Florida. We're looking at the future flood risk and the role of mangroves play in buffering damage during storm-induced flooding and wave. Yes, we have an active project where we found that during Hurricane Irma that hit Florida really significantly in 2017. And we had according to FEMA, there was about $15 million loss in flood damage to the properties in Collier County alone. And we found that the marsh, the mangrove, was able to reduce $13 million damage. In other words, if the mangroves were not there, the damage would have been $63 million. So yes, the mangroves are extremely valuable in Florida, and mangrove is moving north. One day it might get to New York, but it might be a while. That's definitely more effective than some of the marshes in buffering flood.
Okay. Sarah, anything to add before I move on to the next question?
Sure.
Okay. Okay, so we got a question for Peter about the marsh modeling. Does the marsh modeling account for stem bending? Also, do you have modeling that captures the seasonality effect on drag for typho or spartina that could affect buffering efficacy for winter storms?
Good question. Good question. We did not include the bending of the marsh or damage by wind. It's the same thing happens to mangrove as well. So I do have a PhD student doing a dissertation on the damage of mangroves by wind during storms. But we did not really include that in this study because this is a very focused study. We're not supposed to address everything having to do with marsh. So, but it's an interesting topic to look into.
Okay, got a few minutes left here. We're going to go up to 4:10, so we've got time for a few more questions here. Here's a question for Sarah. You spoke about edge stabilization, but how would you ensure sediment supply? How does one ensure sediment supply and prevent marsh edge erosion?
Sediment supply to Piermont is going to come from the main stem of the Hudson. There is one tributary to this marsh, the Sparkhill Creek, but the mouth of it is at the very northern edge near the village, and that sediment supply pretty much gets directly inputted into the Hudson River. So the source of sediment is going to be that inundation of the marsh. So looking over time as sea level is rising and more storms are predicted to be coming through, that delivery of the water onto the marsh surface and that suspended sediment is projected to increase with the rising waters. So that's the current sediment supply. And like I said before, if that seems lacking, we are open to looking at other options like thin-layer replacement.
Okay, we have one more question here that's a point of clarification. So they're asking if we can go back to the slide comparing levels of protection over time. And they want to see, and that's in the context of trying to understand that second bullet in your summary there, Peter. I'm not sure which slide that is, but you've got control still, so I'll leave it to you.
This one?
I believe so. So the question was, we're trying to understand that second bullet in your summary. And that summary bullet was asking, so that second bullet was replacing Phragmites with typha in the 40-acre area would not diminish the buffering capacity of the marsh in Sandy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right, so if we repeat the Sandy simulation by replacing Phragmites by typha, either the entire marsh or just the 40 acres, what we found is the buffering capacity remained the same because the typha was a bit lower, but was not that low. So it was able to retain the same buffering capacity if it happened in September when we measured typha and Phragmites. But if it happened in May when typha was found to be much lower, then it would not have been able to buffer the wave and debris. And that's why the conclusion. Okay.
Thank you, Peter. We
Sure.
are just about out of time here. I'm trying trying to be respectful. I know we went a few minutes over, so I'm trying to be respectful of everybody else's time and calendars and everything. So we'll just end with a big thank you to our speakers for putting together a presentation and sharing the results of this today and for answering our questions. And a second thank you for staying late and answering more questions. I do appreciate that. If you did have a question that didn't get answered, or if you think of something after the fact, you can still ask questions via the exit survey that will launch as soon as you leave the webinar session. So if you have anything that you want to ask the presenters, you can feel free to pass it along that way. Be on the lookout for more webinars. So next month, our next webinar is April 27th at 2 p.m. Eastern time, and that is on the groundwater project in Alaska. So the registration info is available for that, and it went out yesterday, I believe. And with that, we'll end with a big thank you again, and thank you all for attending, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
Nick, for being a great facilitator, and thanks to you too, Peter.
Thank you,
Great
Nick.
working
Thank
with
you,
you.
Sarah. Thank you, Sarah. Bye.
Have a good day.
Bye. You too.